Numberstock came down sideways that morning, the kind of Vermont snow that doesn't fall so much as a tack. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold in my hands, watching the wind whip the pines outside the window, and I thought about my boy. I think about him every morning, 6 years now, and I still set out 2 mugs before I remember. My name is Howard Lattimore. I'm 64 years old, a widower, and until a man named Quinn Marsden knocked on my door in February of 2026, I believed my son had killed himself. That's how it works, you understand. Grief becomes a room you live in. The walls move closer every year, and after a while, you stop noticing the ceiling pressing down on your scalp. You just learn to walk hunched over. Ethan was 29 when he disappeared. November 2020, he'd just been promoted to senior portfolio manager at Caldwell Pierce, this hedge fund with offices in Boston and a satellite branch in Burlington. We were proud, his mother and I. Lord, were we proud. He'd called us the night before from his apartment overlooking Lake Champlain and said, "Dad, I'm going to buy you and Mom that cabin on Moosehead Lake. I'm finally going to do it." I told him, "Slow down, son. You just got the job." He laughed. That laugh. I can still hear it if I close my eyes hard enough. 3 days later, they found his car at the Stowe Pinnacle trailhead. Engine off. Doors unlocked. His wallet on the passenger seat. His phone on the dashboard. Dead. No body. No note. No witnesses. The state police searched for 2 weeks. They had dogs. They had helicopters. They had volunteers from the local Rotary Club walking shoulder to shoulder through the woods. They found nothing. Not a scrap of fabric, not a footprint, not a single thing to tell us where my boy had gone. By week 3, the lead detective, a man named Hollis Vandermeer, sat across from me in my own living room and told me the official theory. Suicide. Probably walked into the woods, found a spot, and let the cold take him. It happens more than you'd think, Vandermeer said. Successful young men, pressure of a new promotion, hidden depression. We see it. My wife Eleanor lost her hair within 4 months. The grief just took it in handfuls until she had to start wearing a scarf. The doctors couldn't explain it. They called it stress alopecia. I called it a mother's heartbreaking in real time. She died in June 2022. The death certificate said heart failure. I knew better. She died of a broken son. After Eleanor passed, I sold the house in Montpelier and moved out to a cabin my grandfather built back in '54, up near the Northeast Kingdom, a place called Glover. Population maybe 1,000 on a good summer day. I had a wood stove, a generator, a 1998 Ford pickup that started 2 times out of 3, and that was about it. I figured I'd live out my days there, stack firewood, listen to the loons, and wait for whatever was going to take me. I wasn't in a hurry to die, you understand, but I wasn't in a hurry to live either. Then came February 9th, 2026. It was a Monday. I remember because I'd just gotten back from town with a bag of dog food for the neighbor's collie that I'd been feeding ever since the neighbor went into a nursing home. I was kicking snow off my boots on the porch when I heard tires on the gravel. A black SUV. Out of state plates. Connecticut. I didn't get visitors. I hadn't had a visitor in 14 months, not counting the propane delivery man. The driver was maybe 33, 34. Black peacoat, leather gloves, the kind of careful good looks you see on lawyers and Mormon missionaries. He stood at the bottom of my steps and looked up at me with this face like he'd been rehearsing what to say for 1,000 miles. "Mr. Lattimore? Who's asking?" "My name is Quinn Marsden. I went to Williams College with your son. We were roommates junior and senior year." I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain exactly. More like something that had been frozen solid was starting to crack. "My son's been dead 6 years, son." He didn't flinch. He just looked at me steady and said, "No, sir, he hasn't. And I think I know where he is. I'll tell you something." In the movies, when somebody says a thing like that, the man on the porch falls to his knees, or grabs the visitor by the collar, or breaks down sobbing. I didn't do any of that. I just stood there in my old red Mackinaw with snow melt running down my forearm, and I said, "You'd better come inside." I made coffee. I always make coffee when I don't know what else to do with my hands. Quinn sat at my kitchen table. The same table where Eleanor and I had eaten 10,000 meals. The same table where we'd opened the manila envelope from the state police that had Ethan's effects in it. And he set down a brown leather folio about 2 inches thick. "Mr. Lattimore," he said, "I need you to listen to everything before you ask questions. Because if you stop me, I might not be able to start again." I sat down opposite him and I nodded. He told me he'd been at Ethan's funeral. I remembered him vaguely, a tall kid in an ill-fitting suit, hung back near the door. He'd cried, he said, but he'd also felt wrong about it. Felt like something didn't fit. Ethan had called him the week before he vanished. Wanted to meet up in Boston, said he'd found something at work. He needed somebody outside the company to see. Quinn had been busy, big quarterly review at his own firm. Told Ethan they'd grab dinner the following weekend. That weekend never came. For 6 years, Quinn had carried that. The weight of, "I'll see you next weekend, brother." The way grief works on a young man with money and time and brains is, it doesn't kill him, it just sits on his shoulders and asks him questions he can't answer. Then last fall, Quinn said, he'd taken a job at a forensic accounting firm out of Hartford. They specialized in financial fraud. The kind of long, boring investigations where you trace shell company to shell company until your eyes bleed. And one Tuesday in October, he'd been pulled into a case involving a hedge fund that had collapsed quietly in 2024 after the SEC came sniffing. Caldwell Pierce. Quinn opened the folio. He laid out documents, wire transfers, internal memos, a spreadsheet with rows and rows of trades, each one flagged with a red mark. "Your son," he said, "was killed because of this spreadsheet." I picked it up. I'm not a finance man. I spent 36 years as a high school history teacher in Montpelier. But I could read columns. I could see the dates. November 9th, 2020. November 10th, 2020. November 10th, 2020. November 11th. Each row was a transaction Ethan had flagged. Each one moved money out of pension accounts into a series of entities with names like Birchwood Holdings, LLC, Coppertop Capital, Northway Strategic. Pension funds, Quinn said. Teachers' pensions. Firefighters. Municipal workers from 3 different states. Caldwell Pierce was looting them, slowly enough that nobody noticed. Your son noticed. "Why would they kill him?" I said. My voice didn't sound like my own. "Why not just fire him?" "Because he wasn't going to be quiet," Quinn said. He'd already contacted somebody at the SEC. There's an email. November 14th. He sent it from his personal account. The day after, his car was found at Stowe. I sat with that. I sat with that for a long time. "You said you knew where he was." Quinn took a breath. He took the kind of breath a man takes before he steps off a high diving board. "I think he's alive, Mr. Purser. Lattimore. I don't know it for certain, but I have reason to believe he's being held." I felt the room slide sideways. I gripped the edge of the table the way a man grips a railing on a pitching ship. Held. "There's a property," Quinn said. "Listed under one of the shell companies, a compound up on the Maine coast near a town called Cutler. 80 acres, private road, dock on the ocean. It was purchased in December 2020, 1 month after your son disappeared. The man who runs Caldwell Pierce, his name is Wendell Beauchamp. The third, his mother, Imelda Beauchamp, owns the property through one of these entities." "Why would they keep him alive?" Quinn looked at me. The kind of look that's full of things a man doesn't want to say out loud. "Leverage," he said. "Information. He knows where he sent that email. He knows who else he might have copied. Until they're sure they've cleaned everything up, he's worth more alive than dead. Barely." I stood up. I walked to the window. The wind had picked up. I could see snow ghosting across the field where Eleanor used to plant her sunflowers. I thought about her, how she died believing her boy was lying somewhere in the woods, frozen, alone. I thought about Detective Vandermeer and his theory. I thought about the empty mug I set out every morning. I turned around. What do we do? Quinn smiled. Just a little. The first time he'd smiled since he walked in the door. I was hoping you'd ask. We didn't go that night. Quinn made me promise that. He said the first thing the Beauchamps would do if they got spooked was disappear. My son for real. Permanent disappear, he called it. And I understood what he meant, so we made a plan. Slow. Careful. Quinn had already been in contact with a federal agent he trusted, a woman named Reyes out of the Boston field office of the FBI. She'd been working pension fraud for 9 years. She'd looked at the file. She believed him. But she needed more than belief. She needed evidence that put the Beauchamps directly at the property, evidence of a living person being held there. I'm 64 years old. My knees are bad. I have a partial plate where my back molars used to be. I'm not built for surveillance. But I had 2 things going for me. 1, nobody on God's green earth would ever suspect an old man in a beat-up Ford pickup of being any kind of threat. 2, I'd spent 36 years teaching teenagers. I knew how to wait. Quinn and I drove down to Maine on the morning of February 14th. Valentine's Day. I remember the date because Eleanor used to make me pancakes shaped like hearts every February 14th, even after the kids were grown, even when it was just the 2 of us. We crossed into Maine on Route 2 and I watched the sun come up over the Saco River, and I thought, Eleanor, I am going to bring our boy home or die trying. We'd rented a small cabin 12 miles from the Beauchamp property. Quinn had set it up under a fake name. We had a satellite phone, a long-range scope, a pair of motion-activated trail cameras, and a sealed envelope of cash. We had Agent Reyes on speed dial. We had 2 weeks of supplies. The first 3 days, we just watched. The Beauchamp compound sat at the end of a private gravel road that ran 2 miles through pine forest before it opened up to a clearing on a bluff over the Atlantic. There was a main house, a guest house, a barn that had been converted to a garage with 4 bay doors, and a small outbuilding down by the dock. The dock had a boat at it, a 40-foot something, white hull, blue trim. The kind of boat a rich man uses to feel like a man. I sat in a duck blind we'd built off the eastern property line, dressed in 7 layers of wool, and I watched. Through the scope, I saw a groundskeeper come and go. I saw a middle-aged woman, severe, gray-haired, who matched the photograph Quinn had shown me of Imelda Beauchamp. I saw a man in his mid-50s, soft in the middle, tan in February, who matched Wendell. I saw a younger man, maybe 40, with a shaved head and a sidearm on his hip, who I came to think of as the Watcher. He patrolled. He smoked. He had a routine. On day 4, just after dusk, the Watcher walked from the main house down a snow-cleared path to the small outbuilding by the dock. He carried a tray. Steam came off it, even from 200 yards away. Somebody was inside that outbuilding. Somebody who needed a hot meal. I called Quinn on the radio. Quinn called Reyes. Reyes said, "That's good. That's something. I need more." So I waited. For 9 more days, I watched that outbuilding. The Watcher delivered food twice a day, morning and evening. On day 7, I saw a doctor arrive. Black bag, gray hair, frightened eyes. He stayed for 40 minutes. On day 9, I saw the Watcher carry a small bundle of clothing into the outbuilding, then come out with a different bundle, dirty, that he tossed into a bin. On day 10, I saw something that changed everything. It was just past 4 in the afternoon. The light was starting to fail. The Watcher had gone up to the main house for what I'd learned was his shift change. For about 11 minutes, the path to the outbuilding was unwatched. A figure came to the small window. The window was set high, covered in a metal grate, but for one instant, a face pressed against the glass. I had the scope up. I had the focus dialed. I saw a man maybe 35. Gaunt, bearded, hair grown long past his shoulders. He had a scar above his left eyebrow, the kind that runs jagged like a question mark. Ethan got that scar when he was 11 years old, falling off a sled on the hill behind our house in Montpelier. I'd carried him bleeding into the kitchen, and Eleanor had stitched him up herself because the urgent care was 40 minutes away and he was already laughing again. I made a sound I don't have a name for. Then I keyed the radio with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and I said, "Quinn, he's there. My boy is there." Reyes moved fast after that. She had what she called probable cause now. We'd given her photographs through the scope, dated geotagged. We'd given her the Watcher's patrol patterns. We'd given her everything except the one thing she needed most, which was a tactical entry plan that wouldn't get my son killed in the first 30 seconds of a raid. The Beauchamps had what Reyes called insurance protocols. If the FBI came to the front gate, somebody inside would make a phone call. The Watcher would walk down to the outbuilding. My boy wouldn't be there by the time the front door opened. So we needed to make the front door open without anyone making a phone call. Reyes brought in a tactical team out of the Bangor resident agency. 6 men and 1 woman, plus her. They staged at our cabin on the night of February 24th. Quiet, professional. Nobody talked much. They drank our coffee, and they cleaned their gear, and they listened while Reyes ran them through it one more time. The plan had 2 parts. Part 1 was a diversion. A tow truck Reyes had borrowed from the local sheriff would call the Beauchamp compound at 5:47 a.m., claiming a downed tree was blocking the private road, and they needed permission to send a crew. The Beauchamps would dispatch the Watcher and the compound's plow truck to go check. The Watcher would meet a federal team 2 miles out on the gravel road, where he'd be detained. Part 2 was the entry. 2 teams. Team 1 would breach the main house. Team 2, smaller, would go straight for the outbuilding. Reyes looked at me across the cabin's small dining table. "Mr. Mastery, Lattimore." "Yes, ma'am." "You are not coming on this raid." "Yes, ma'am. You are going to be at our staging area. If we extract your son alive, I will personally drive you to the hospital we transport him to. But you are not setting foot on that property until I tell you it's secure. Are we clear?" "Yes, ma'am." "Look me in the eye and say it again." I looked her in the eye. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about every promise I'd ever broken to my wife, and every promise I'd kept, and how this was the one promise I couldn't afford to break to a stranger. "I will not set foot on that property until you tell me it's secure." She nodded. She believed me. I think she believed me because she could see in my face that I'd already buried this boy once, and I couldn't bury him twice. The raid went down at 6:02 a.m. on February 25th, 2026. I sat in the back of an unmarked sedan with a young agent named Murphy, who wasn't quite 30 and who kept making small talk about how his father had been a teacher too in Massachusetts and how he'd gotten into the bureau out of Northeastern. I let him talk. He needed to talk. I think he was scared on my behalf. The radio crackled. "Tow truck contact, 547. Target dispatched." Then, 6 minutes later, "Watcher in custody. No alarm raised." Repeat. "No alarm raised." Then, 11 minutes after that, "Main house breached. 2 suspects in custody. No shots fired." Then 20 seconds of silence that lasted 40 years. Then, outbuilding entry. "Stand by." Murphy in the front seat had his hand on the back of his neck. I had my hands flat on my knees because that was the only way I could keep them from doing whatever it is hands do when a man's whole world is balanced on a single radio call. Subject located. Subject is alive. Repeat. Subject is alive. Repeat. Subject is alive. EMS to staging. I put my face in my hands, and I cried for the first time since Eleanor's funeral. Reyes was true to her word. She drove me herself, in the same unmarked sedan, behind the ambulance that took my son to the regional medical center in Machias. We didn't talk on the drive. There was nothing to say. I watched the back of the ambulance, and I prayed in a way I hadn't prayed since I was a boy in Sunday school in Barre. At the hospital, they took him through the emergency entrance, and a nurse with kind eyes and a clipboard came out to find me in the waiting room. She said he was severely malnourished. He had a healed fracture in his left wrist, that hadn't been set properly. He had vitamin deficiencies, signs of long-term confinement, frostbite scars on 3 toes, but he was alive. And he was asking for his father. I walked into that hospital room on legs that didn't feel like mine. He was sitting up in the bed. His hair was long and matted. His beard came halfway down his chest. He'd been 30 when they took him. He looked 50 now. His eyes, though, his eyes were Ethan's eyes. The same eyes that had looked up at me from a Little League dugout when he was 9 years old, and he'd struck out, and he was trying so hard not to cry. Dad. I crossed the room. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took my son's hand. His hand was so thin I could feel every bone in it. I knew, he said, and his voice broke. I knew you'd come. I knew you wouldn't believe it. I knew your mother, I said. He saw it in my face. He didn't ask. He just nodded once, and tears ran down both sides of his face into that wild beard. And we sat there holding hands and not saying anything for a long, long time. The trial started in October 2026. Wendell Beauchamp III was charged with kidnapping, conspiracy to commit murder, securities fraud, wire fraud, racketeering, and 22 counts of mail fraud. His mother, Imelda, was charged as a co-conspirator on every count. The watcher, whose real name was a former Special Forces sergeant named Roland Pike, took a plea deal in exchange for testifying. He told the court everything. He told them how Wendell had ordered Ethan grabbed off the trailhead at Stowe, how they'd transported him in the trunk of a car for 9 hours up to the Maine coast, how they'd kept him in that outbuilding for 5 years and 3 months, fed him twice a day, brought a doctor when he got sick, never let him outside, how they'd made him write 3 letters under duress, letters they were going to use as evidence of suicide if his body ever needed to be produced. How, every 6 months, Wendell had personally come down to the outbuilding and offered Ethan a deal, tell us every name, every email, every contact, and we'll let you go. Ethan, my boy, had said no. Every single time, for 5 years and 3 months. When the prosecutor asked him on the stand why, my son looked at the jury and he said, because the moment I told them, I'd be dead. And because there were a lot of teachers and firefighters who needed somebody to say no. The jury was out for 4 hours. Wendell Beauchamp got life without parole. Imelda got 45 years, which at her age is the same thing. The pension funds got their money back, every cent, plus damages, after a civil suit that took another 14 months to wind up. Ethan was awarded $8.6 million in restitution. He gave half of it to a foundation he started, called the Eleanor Lattimore Fund, which provides legal aid to families of missing persons whose cases have been closed prematurely by law enforcement. The other half he used to buy a small place on Moosehead Lake, in Maine, the cabin he'd promised his mother and me back in 2020. He goes there every summer. So do I. Detective Hollis Vandermeer took early retirement in 2027. He sent me a letter, 3 pages, longhand, from a man I had every reason to hate. He said he was sorry. He said he should have looked harder. He said the suicide theory was the path of least resistance, and he'd taken it because his caseload was crushing him, and Ethan's case had no obvious evidence of foul play. He said he thought about my son every day. I wrote him back. I said I forgave him. I said it because it was true. The man who had failed my boy was a tired civil servant in a tired department, and the men who had taken my boy were monsters who had counted on tired civil servants. I wasn't going to give the monsters the satisfaction of poisoning me against the only kind of people who could have saved him sooner. Quinn Marsden is the godfather of my granddaughter now. Ethan met a woman in his 2nd year of recovery, a trauma counselor named Maeve, and they have a little girl named Ellie after my Eleanor. Quinn flew up for the christening. He stood at the front of the church in Glover, this kid who had carried a folio across state lines on a hunch, and when the priest asked if he'd renounce evil on behalf of the child, Quinn looked at me, and he nodded, and he said, I do. I'll tell you the thing I think about the most. It isn't the raid. It isn't the trial. It isn't even the moment Reyes' voice came over the radio and said my son was alive. It's the morning after. I woke up in a cheap motel in Machias with sun coming through the curtains, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't have to remember anything. There was nothing to remember. My boy was alive. He was 3 blocks away. I was going to see him in an hour. I got up. I went into the little motel kitchenette. I made coffee. I poured 1 mug. Just 1. And I stood there at the window with that single steaming mug in my hand. And I looked east toward the ocean. And I said out loud, "Eleanor, honey, we got him back. We got our boy back." The wind off the Atlantic shook the motel sign. The sun came up over the water, the way it always does, the way it had every morning my wife was alive and every morning she wasn't. And I knew, sure as I knew my own name, that somewhere she had heard me. 6 years she'd carried that grief. 6 years she'd carried it after her. We don't carry it anymore. Some nights now, when I'm up at the cabin in Glover and the loons are calling out on the pond, my granddaughter Ellie comes and climbs in my lap. She's 3. She's got her grandmother's eyes. She points at the framed photograph on my mantel, the one of Eleanor in her wedding dress in 1981. And she says, "That's Grandma Ellie." And I say, "Yes, sweetheart, that's Grandma Ellie. She's the reason you're here. She's the reason all of us are here, because I'll tell you something about a mother's love and a father's stubbornness. They don't quit. They don't quit when the police close the file. They don't quit when the years stack up like cordwood. They don't quit when a tired old man sits at a kitchen table setting out 2 mugs for a son the world has told him is dead. They wait. They wait for a knock on the door on a Monday in February. They wait for a young man in a peacoat with a brown leather folio under his arm. They wait for the moment when the impossible becomes the merely difficult, and the difficult becomes the road home. That's the only thing I have left to teach. After 36 years of teaching history to 17-year-olds, after 64 years of being somebody's son and somebody's husband and somebody's father, the only lesson I have left is this: don't quit on the people you love. Not ever. Not even when the whole world tells you they're gone. Sometimes the world is wrong. Sometimes a knock comes. And sometimes, if you've kept the porch light on long enough, the boy you buried walks back up out of the dark. I've sat with this story a long time before telling it, and I'll tell you what I've come to understand. Every step of what happened to my boy was a chain of choices made by other people. Wendell Beauchamp chose greed. His mother Imelda chose to protect him. Detective Vandermeer chose the easy answer. Caldwell Pierce chose to look the other way for years before any of it ever touched my family. None of it was fate. None of it was bad luck. It was choices all the way down. And choices have weight. But here's the other side of that same coin. Quinn Marsden made a choice too. He chose to keep a folio under his arm and drive 10 hours into a Vermont snowstorm on nothing but a hunch and a promise he'd made to himself at a funeral. Agent Reyes chose to believe a young accountant and an old man in a flannel shirt. My son Ethan, sitting in that outbuilding for 5 winters, chose to keep saying no every time they offered him a way out that would have cost other people their pensions. And me, an old widower setting out 2 coffee mugs every morning, I chose not to stop hoping even when hoping made me look like a fool. That's what I want any father or mother listening to take with them. The world is going to hand you stories about your loved ones, and some of those stories will be wrong. And some of those wrong stories will come from people in uniforms with badges and clipboards. Listen to them. But don't let them be the last word. Use your head. Ask the question they didn't ask. Read the file twice. Call the friend who knew them best. The mind is the only weapon any of us really have against a system that's tired and overworked and willing to close a folder before it's done. And nerve. Lord, you'll need nerve. There were nights up at that cabin in Glover when I wanted to lie down in the snow and let the cold take me the way Vandermeer said it had taken my boy. I didn't, and I can't even tell you why. Some part of me kept getting up, kept feeding the wood stove, kept feeding the neighbor's dog. I think now that was Eleanor. I think she'd built that habit into me over 41 years of marriage, and it outlived her. Whatever it was, I'm grateful for it, because if I'd quit, Quinn would have knocked on a dark door. So decency in your bones, sharpness in your mind, and the stubbornness to keep walking when there's no road. Those are the 3 things. Hold on to them in your worst hour, and one Monday in February, the The door knocks, and the world gives back what it took.